In this video, we'll take a look at the relationship between Paul and George and how their creative differences led to some of the most iconic songs in Beatles history. During the final days of the Beatles, leading up to their inevitable split, the band were not in a good place. For months, the Fab Four became bogged down by a number of feuds and arguments. Their exceptional success had made it so their egos clashed over a plethora of issues, both personal and professional. And it was never worse than during the recording of their final album, Let It Be. Things were, of course, made worse by the fact the recording process was being filmed for a documentary at the same time, meaning that every move was being documented. Eventually, this led to disagreements between the band. George Harrison, in particular, had issues with Paul McCartney.
I think I'll be leaving the band now.
When?
Now.
There was a bit of a row going on between Paul and I. You can see it, where he's saying, well, don't play this or something, and I'm saying, well, you know, I'll play what you want, or I won't play if you don't want it, you know, just make up your mind. That kind of stuff was going on. And they were filming and recording us having a row, you know, it was terrible, really.
Yeah. All right?
Yeah.
That's the only time that works, really, is on the last line.
Oh, forget the last line.
I'm just trying to get a bit, we'll try, you know, sort of go right through and keep talking about it.
Okay, girls.
So, George Harrison was frequently pushed to the side by both McCartney and John Lennon while they were songwriting. It got to the point where he was only granted a few songs on each album. For example, on Revolver, only 3 of his songs were included on the 14-track album. Likewise, on Abbey Road, Harrison was granted 2 solo tracks, as well as 3 collaborative songs with both McCartney and Lennon. But when they gave George his chance to express his creativity, he would write some truly unbelievable tracks. The star, who was the youngest member of the Beatles, wrote such iconic songs, such as Something, Here Comes the Sun, and While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Despite these unbelievable successes, McCartney's constant habit of pushing Harrison aside left a mental mark on him that he couldn't eventually shake. Harrison later said in an interview, "I had no confidence in myself as a guitar player, having spent so many years with Paul McCartney." He then went on to say, "He ruined me as a guitar player."
Been able to have any reconciliation with Paul since that particular event?
Oh, he's okay, yeah. He's okay. He just was trying to use that situation for some personal motive that he had, and it just didn't work. But, you know, we're long past all the squabbles now.
How did you feel when you heard the McCartney versions of the old songs on Broad Street?
I think they were okay. I didn't notice that they were new versions.
He said that he wanted to tackle some of the other old songs, including possibly some of John Lennon's songs, like Beautiful Boy and Imagine. Does that surprise you that he would do that?
Paul?
Yeah.
Maybe because he ran out of good ones of his own.
Well, now we've got that on record.
Harrison's wife at the time, Pattie Boyd, also spoke out about how the quiet Beatle was feeling behind the scenes. She recalled George would come home after a recording session and be utterly furious. She said, "The Beatles made him unhappy with the constant arguments. They were vicious to each other. That was really upsetting, and even more so for him because he had this new spiritual avenue. Like a little brother, he was constantly pushed into the background. He would come home from recording and be full of anger. It was a very bad state that he was in." In a 1979 Rolling Stone interview, George was asked his thoughts about Paul's latest album, to which he replied, "I think it's inoffensive. I've always preferred Paul's good melodies to his screaming rock and roll tunes. All the noisy, beaty things I'm not into at all." When asked if he would consider forming a band again with Paul, George said, "Well, now we don't have any problems whatsoever as far as being people is concerned, and it's quite nice to see him. But I don't know about being in a band with him. How that would work out, I'm not sure." From a therapist perspective, the dynamic of the relationship between Paul and George was almost like a brother to brother. So naturally, conflicts and disputes are always going to happen. I think it's very easy for us to underestimate the situation which they found themselves in. Only a handful of people in the history of music have found themselves in a position where they're so under pressure, they're so big, and also when they're producing music or when they're on tour, they're almost experiencing cabin fever. They're living and working in close proximity day in, day out, which simply isn't sustainable in the long term. Of course, this will lead to people falling out and arguments. But the flip side of this is actually the Beatles dominated the music scene for such a long time. Perhaps it's easy to highlight the disagreements and disputes when really they deserve so much praise for being able to resolve the differences and stay together as a group for as long as they did. So I think not just Paul and George, but all four Beatles did as well as they could given the circumstances they found themselves in at such a young age as well. And as far as we can tell, it seems like they were all on good terms years after the band split. But of course, this is just my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments.
He didn't know I could whistle.